It is Wednesday, August the 26th, 2020. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff and George. On today's show, things we dreamed not before. 1619 Project. Yeah, if that title sounds kind of ambiguous, it's because I have some conflicted feelings about the 1619 Project that are pretty complicated. Took the time to reason out some of those feelings for you today, which I hope you appreciate. And of course, if you really do appreciate that sort of thing, you can go to patreon.com/distantpeasant. You'll become a recurring donor for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons. If you go to that website and you look for the highest roller patron of the Distant Peasant Podcast, you may be surprised as to who it is. If that person is tuning in, I want to welcome them, thank them and everyone for their time and attention, and also their support. Thank you very much. Just one more note, not having to do with the 1619 Project. Got a little other project cooking up over at twitch.tv/postrevolution. 3 words, 2 are the same. Post-revolution. Yeah, we're going to do some streaming over there with my boys, Kenny and Bro, as I call them. Not their real names. Internet characters. But real people whom you can learn more about, and me, as I helm a little show over there, Mondays at 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Got a little Adult Swim vibe going. Of course, those are East Coast times. Again, that is twitch.tv/postrevolution. You can look for content there. Check it out if you want to. On with the show. I am not a historian, or at least I don't fit even loosely the academic qualifications that being a historian would require. Now, this has its drawbacks, but it also has its advantages, as it gives me certain inclinations and appreciations that I find lacking in most historians, even the decent ones I like. It is as if an ocean of human knowledge were laid before them as infinitely deep as it is wide, and they then confined themselves to diving ever deeper in ever narrower columns. They will never run out of things to study, or ways to study them, yet each of themselves, as fonts of wisdom, tends towards the obscure and esoteric. The best ones combine intellectual rigor with an active resistance to this phenomenon, in my opinion. If they don't, their curiosity becomes exhausted in these narrow lanes. They become ill-equipped and unappreciative of just how vast the ocean is, how filled it is with traps and tricks and illusions and even difficulties driven by nothing more than natural imperfection in the human observer. Yet the study goes on, with much work done and much knowledge generated and refined, but with ever fewer minds capable of telling a pretty good story that seeks to incorporate that knowledge across the columns, and appreciative of the power that comes with doing so. Nicole Hannah-Jones is not a historian either. She's a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine, and she and I are alike in this one regard, I think. We both think ourselves capable of telling a pretty good story. And even if we're wrong, we both certainly like to give it a good try. We are appreciative, in any case, of the power of a good story. And I would also venture to guess that we both see ourselves as dreamers of dreams, though one of us has far better access to resources and experience success bringing those dreams about, granted. After diving into the 1619 Project, however, which is the resulting series of media properties that are being generated by her initial pitch and thesis statement to the board, I can't help but think there's something less than noble happening. what I thought was something like a decent enough and needed corrective to the traditional founding myths of the United States of America and its culture and society as a parade of white men forging liberty out of thin air. Well, it turns out not to be that at all, or at least not quite. Rather, to me, what amounts to a totalizing notion that capital E everything that is particularly American has its roots in the enslavement of black people by white people, in a series of just-so stories that are supposed to illustrate this. Now, I find 1619 a better place to begin than, say, 1776, or even the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. And I hope this might not seem to be such a bad place to begin to you either. Hopefully it will come as no surprise, dear listener, that I have striven on this show to appreciate just some of the numerous and dreadful ways slavery and white supremacy has shaped the government, politics, and culture of the United States. In it lies strands of causality that have, for hundreds of years, to take just a few examples, amplified the place of property in popular political philosophy, divided and conquered organized labor, and left us today with a shamefully enduring proportion of the population that believes that it is just obviously true that white people are better than black ones, or at least that black people ought not complain so much about an America that begrudgingly includes them. The last of these beliefs, this commonly held and somewhat ambient white supremacy, casual and obvious, but not quite as virulent and open as to be distasteful, I fear I am very familiar with it, as it pervades my particular community for as long as I can recall, alongside a smaller but still sizable group of white nationalists and neo-Confederate types. To take a more specific and concrete example, the material conditions of housing and employment in this country in the closer and more industrialized past have been shaped and continue to be shaped by the idea that white people ought not to have to live near black people, that they have their communities and culture and white people have theirs. Black people's socioeconomic conditions are spoken of as America's blemishes, for whom responsibility is placed squarely on the shoulders of black people themselves. White people's as either admirable features or regrettable shortcomings in need of, at the very least, rhetorical, if not material, attention. For life is not fair in a more perfect union, an ever elusive and virtuous quest. These are some of the legacies of slavery and white supremacy in America, a matter of extreme and ongoing concern in the age of Black Lives Matter and police brutality. And I want to be as clear as I possibly can be. This is a story that needs telling, in a country where many deny the Civil War was even fought over slavery. And worse for the white people who do accept that chattel slavery was worse than what came after it, far from agreeing about whether anything else should be done to correct this fact. The accounts of slaves, both written and audio recordings, should be consulted. You can go visit them right now. The Library of Congress has them posted online, as should descriptions of the slave trade, the broader causes and effects of chattel slavery itself in the colonies, in as much detail as is appropriate for the age in question, at both the micro and macro levels. All this is a vital piece of the picture in understanding the word America. I've done my best on this show in the past to tell of this story what I feel able to. But I have been deliberate in my language this episode, and have spoken thus far of white people and black people, and not just to reflect colloquial shorthand, for this is how the material of the project inevitably reads. I quote now at length from an article entitled Why We Published the 1619 Project by Jake Silverstein, for I am an honest man, and respect those who want compelling details in their stories just as much as any New York Times Magazine writer. Quote, 1619 is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date in our country's history. Those who do are at most a tiny fraction of those who can tell you that 1776 is the year of our nation's birth. What if, however, we were to tell you that the moment that the country's defining contradictions first came into the world was in late August of 1619? That was when a ship arrived at Port Comfort in the British colony of Virginia, bearing a cargo of 20 to 30 enslaved Africans. Their arrival inaugurated a barbaric system of chattel slavery that would last for the next 250 years. This is sometimes referred to as the country's original sin, but it is more than that. It is the country's very origin. Out of slavery and the anti-black racism it required, grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet and popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this day. The seeds of all that were planted long before our official birth date in 1776, when the man known as our founders formally declared independence from Britain. The goal of the 1619 Project is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country. The 1619 Project began with the publication in August 2019 of a special issue of the New York Times Magazine containing essays of different aspects of contemporary American life, from mass incarceration to rush hour traffic, that have their roots in slavery and its aftermath. Each essay takes up a modern phenomenon, familiar to all, and reveals its history. The first by the staff writer Nicole Hannah-Jones, from whose mind this project sprang, provides the intellectual framework for the project and can be read as an introduction, end quote. As I said before, to regard 1619 as the nation's birth year is a fine place to start, truly. For it is when three roughly defined, roughly separate groups, European colonists, indigenous peoples, and slaves from Africa, all intersected on land that would one day become the United States. And along with somewhat later immigrants to this land of all different kinds, from all different places, the story of America is the story of them all. And to focus on the slaves from Africa and their descendants is a valid part of the story, if not the whole. In fact, I do think there's a problem with the exercise's limited focus. And I am not alone in this. I quote now from a public letter, signed by 12 historians and political scientists regarding the project, quote, "It is not our purpose to question the significance of slavery in the American past. None of us have any disagreement with the need for Americans, as they consider their history, to understand that the past is populated by sinners as well as saints, by horrors as well as honors, and that is particularly true of the scarred legacy of slavery. As historians and students of the founding of the Civil War era, our concern is that the 1619 Project offers a historically limited view of slavery, especially since slavery was not just or even exclusively an American malady, and grew up in a larger context of forced labor and race. Moreover, the breadth of 400 years and 300 million people cannot be compressed into single-size interpretations. Yet the 1619 Project asserts that every aspect of American life has only one lens for viewing, that of slavery and its fallout. America wasn't a democracy until black Americans made it one, insists the lead essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones. American capitalism is brutal. You can trace that to the plantation, asserts another by Matthew Desmond. In some cases, history is reduced to metaphor. How segregation caused your traffic jam. End quote. Personally, I would avoid such earnest language about saints and sinners of history. Things are always more complicated than that and driven by material conditions. But certainly, broadly speaking, we can and should make judgments about whose ideas and lives are more worthy than others. In my opinion, that's one of the main points of learning any of this in the first place. The letter goes on to some errors of fact, some of which I'll go into. And I should note that this isn't just a bunch of white academics either. Dr. William Barclay Adam, for example, would probably react strongly to anyone who's seriously held for that idea in his face. There have been other letters, though. One slightly harsher letter was indeed signed by 4 historians who are all well respected across their field. Quote, "We applaud all efforts to address the enduring centrality of slavery and racism to our history. Some of us have devoted our entire professional lives to those efforts, and all of us have worked hard to advance them. Raising profound, unsettling questions about slavery in the nation's past and present, as the 1619 Project does, is a praiseworthy and urgent public service. Nevertheless, we are dismayed at some of the factual errors in the project and the closed process behind it. These errors, which concern major events, cannot be described as interpretation or framing. They are matters of verifiable fact, which are the foundation of both honest scholarship and honest journalism. They suggest a disagreement of historical understanding by ideology, dismissal of objections on racial grounds, that they are the objections of only white historians, has affirmed that displacement, end quote. And indeed, Nicole Hannah-Jones and others have been known to use this framing in defense of their efforts, despite the diverse nature of their objectors. There is one other voice I'd give the stage over to for a moment. Dr. Leslie M. Harris is a professor of history at Northwestern University. She is a black woman, and while I am certain that both of us have some thoughts on the 1619 Project that the other doesn't, I am equally certain that we have some that we share. I quote some of those shared thoughts now from an opinion piece in Politico headlined, "I helped fact-check the 1619 Project. The Times ignored me." Quote, "In August 2019 of last year, I listened in stunned silence as Nicole Hannah-Jones, a reporter for the New York Times, repeated an idea that I had vigorously argued against with her fact-checker, that the Patriots fought the American Revolution in large part to preserve slavery in North America. Hannah-Jones and I were on Georgia Public Radio to discuss the path-breaking New York Times 1619 Project, a major feature about the impact of slavery on American history, which she spearheaded. The Times had just published the special 1619 edition of its magazine, which took its name from the year 20 Africans arrived in the colony of Virginia, a group believed to be the first enslaved Africans to arrive in British North America. Weeks before, I had received an email from a New York Times research editor. Because I am a historian of African American life and slavery in New York specifically, and the pre-Civil War era more generally, she wanted me to verify some statements for the project. At one point, she sent me this assertion. One critical reason that the colonists declared their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery in the colonies, which had produced tremendous wealth. At the time, there were growing calls to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire, which would have badly damaged the economies of colonies in both North and South. I vigorously disputed the claim. Although slavery was certainly an issue in the American Revolution, the protection of slavery was not one of the main reasons the 13 colonies went to war. The editor followed up with several questions probing the nature of slavery in the colonial era, such as whether enslaved people were allowed to read, could legally marry, could congregate in groups of more than 4, and could own, will, or inherit property, the answers to which vary widely depending on the era and the colony. I explained these histories as best I could with references to specific examples, but never heard back from her about how the information would be used, end quote. Dr. Harris continues from there to talk specifics, and makes clear that she is gravely concerned that these errors are particularly regrettable to her, given how desperately underappreciated the legacy of slavery and white supremacy is in the United States, and I absolutely agree with her. I promised you the introduction and framing essay, entitled, "Our Founding Ideals of Liberty and Equality Were False When They Were Written. Black Americans Fought to Make Them True. Without this struggle, America would have no democracy at all." Some criticism in this essay has been focused on her claim that the American colonies seceded from Britain, like I mentioned before, in part to protect the institution of slavery from a growing abolitionist movement in Britain. This has been yielded on to the point that to some it has become synonymous, either justly or unjustly, with historians' chief gripe about the whole project. Ryan Grimm of The Intercept, whom I mostly like, put it this way, for example, I saw, and while I think that's a bit ungenerous, we're still talking about the point of the American Revolution. Could these historians be anything but defensive about such a thing? For the record, abolitionism with a capital A movement was basically just beginning around the time as a popular movement in Britain, though America's Quakers from the Isles and a smattering of evangelical communities from the Isles already had a good, if very small, head of steam behind them. So this sort of thing was a generation or two away from being a concern. The claim that it was the wealth generated by slavery in America that gave the ruling class the gumption to break and war with the mightiest empire on earth also overstates things. The South was much poorer than the North, but the South had much more rich people in it. And it was really the richest, not just of the plantation economy, but of the entire eastern seaboard of America, that made all of them think they could pull the thing off as a project. And of course, they were salivating for the rich lands to the west, like in the Ohio Valley, that Great Britain preferred to keep as buffer land. Ironically, in the introduction, I think Thomas Jefferson gets let off too easy, as his cruelty is horrifically detailed, but he is also designated as an average master. I suppose this is somewhat a matter of opinion, but he never manumitted any of his slaves save a few, even upon his death. Washington at least willed all his free, for example, and to my recollection, he was one of the crueler masters for his time and place. Though I am not willing to fight too hard about whether or not Jefferson was just an average piece of shit or an exceptional piece of shit, though for the record, I hold with exceptional piece of shit. But by far, my least favorite part of the introduction, which has gotten some attention, the racism as DNA passage. It's worth quoting with context before and after, and I do so now. Quote, in 1868, Congress ratified the 14th Amendment, ensuring citizenship to any person born in the United States. Today, thanks to this amendment, every child born here to a European, Asian, African, Latin American, or Middle Eastern immigrant gains automatic citizenship. The 14th Amendment also, for the first time, constitutionally guaranteed equal protection under the law. Ever since, nearly all other marginalized groups have used the 14th Amendment in their fights for equality, including the recent successful arguments before the Supreme Court on behalf of same-sex marriage. Finally, in 1870, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the most critical aspect of democracy and citizenship, the right to vote, to all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. For this fleeting moment known as Reconstruction, the majority in Congress seemed to embrace the idea that out of the ashes of the Civil War, we could create the multinational democracy that Black Americans envisioned, even if our founding fathers did not. But it would not last. Anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, as does the belief, so well articulated by Lincoln, that Black people are the obstacle to national unity. The many gains of Reconstruction were met with fierce white resistance throughout the South, including unthinkable violence against the formerly enslaved, wide-scale voter suppression, electoral fraud, and even, in some extreme cases, the overthrow of democratically elected biracial governments. Faced with this unrest, the federal government decided that Black people were the cause of the problem, and that for unity's sake, it would leave the white South to its own devices. End quote. Certainly the offending clause could be excised and the section rewritten. One's own genetics are not a matter of conscious engineering, but of biology, an immutable product of nature. One may work with it, or perhaps around it, but one cannot change their own DNA. I tend to think the problem goes a little deeper than flawed metaphor, though. There's a fatalism to all this, as one can guess from the broad outlines of every story the project tells. This bad thing, that bad thing, know where it comes from. The enslavement of Black people. And though it asserts that Black people have made America more free and purports to tell this story too, the project actually has very little to say about the amazing specifics of who did so and how. Now, even if everything the project had in it were true, and as I've noted, at least a few of its claims are in serious doubt in more minds than just my own, the project is supposed to aim to, and I quote again from Why We Published the 1619 Project by J. Silverstein, quote, place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country, end quote. While much is said of slavery and anti-black racism, the story doesn't center black people's contributions so much as their subjugation by whites, and how that has shaped contribution to the country's social and political institutions. I could go on about this, but I hope at least, that I have made myself clear in two things. The first is that a corrective is needed, and how people imagine how America came to be what it is in people's minds, and the effects and consequences of the systematic enslavement of black people and the supporting ideological superstructures of that enslavement is foundational to that idea. The second is that this project is not the needed correction. The story is overly reductionist, and it seems to me that what the New York Times wanted was something with the imprimatur of credibility that academic and journalistic institutions can convey, without troubling themselves too much to actually listen to such people. Reading it as a supplemental is not a great idea either, because it is so totalizing in its language and makes several consequential and regrettable errors of fact, a few of which I've shared, that teaching it would be an exercise in dodging landmines. There are much better primary and secondary sources on this sort of thing that already exist, albeit less slickly produced and highly marketed than this series of trademark New York Times Magazine products, special edition magazine podcasts, K-12's curriculum, and lecture series, with more to come, surely. However, speaking of historians, there's one criticism that many decent ones have lobbed towards the project that I don't share. They claim one of its problems is that the project is ideologically driven and is thus less concerned with matters of fact than it should be. I think the truth is that all history is ideologically driven, and so while they aren't wrong, they aren't quite right either. The best stories we tell ourselves, about ourselves, combine empirical rigor with ideology, and from this people draw truth and meaning from the story. Now, I've held for truth a fair bit already, and so meaning deserves at least a nod. This is a grim and dark view of America, this meaning they're attempting to convey, I think, and it's dark because not much light can pass through so small a hole they've defined. I leave for you, dear listener, to decide for yourself what meaning the 1619 Project is seeking to convey in, quote, slavery is the country's very origin. Out of slavery and the anti-black racism it required grew nearly everything that has made America exceptional. Its economic might, its industrial power, its electoral system, its diet and popular music, the inequities of its public health and education, its astonishing penchant for violence, its income inequality, the example it sets for the world as a land of freedom and equality, its slang, its legal system, and the endemic racial fears and hatreds that continue to plague it to this day. End quote. That really isn't enough, though. I say a historical corrective is needed. I say this is not the needed corrective. And this leaves me in an awkward place, however sincerely I got there. Look at Mr. Babbitt both ways over here. So smart and measured. Such brilliant words to disguise his easy contrarianism. He's just courageous enough to seriously complain about this, and would never be courageous enough to seriously explain it, as if he could ever do better at it, or perhaps more darkly, as if I would ever deign to try to do better at it. Perhaps I care more about complaining about a piece of media that places, quote, the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are, end quote, than describing how such a project could be improved. People can judge for themselves whether they think I deserve all that, but I can assure you that I am afraid of it being true, and it is with these fears in mind that I paint my own vision, though I will confine myself to some broad thoughts on colonial and early America. First, our goals need a little adjusting. To place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of the story of America would require the inclusion of actors, I think, who do not fit neatly into white enslavers / slave tolerators or black slaves. And among these, I would speak for a little bit specifically of the indigenous peoples of America, who used to, of course, live on the land where this slavery is taking place. From where I sit, it would seem that the death and exploitation of those peoples in the Americas by white colonists beginning long before 1619 is what really kicked off the development of white identity. Here was the primary other that these descendants of Europe would define themselves against, and it both fed into and then was fed by the importation of labor from Africa into the Americas. The first slaves in the Americas were the indigenous people of the place themselves, of course. In fact, slaves from far away in Africa were imported in part because those indigenous people here themselves were also beginning to coalesce into different identities as a result of the depopulation of European contact. And as slaves, they would often flee into these other rapidly forming communities, the survivors of the depopulation and colonization that had been preceding the Americas since the 15th century. In time, ex-slaves from Africa and their descendants would also contribute to these communities as well. To take just one example, Uncle Sam had to fight not just one war, but a series of wars against just one tribe in an episode usually called the Seminole Wars. Let me put it this way. Imagine these groups of European colonists setting themselves up on these depopulated lands here and there on the eastern seaboard, on land that would one day become the United States of America. And imagine Europe, just a few generations back from that. And in both cases, imagine two white people encountering each other. In the latter case, the few generations back case, it really wouldn't have meant too much, as people were more concerned with distinctions like whether one was noble or common, or whether one were French or German, or whether one was Catholic or Anglican or Presbyterian or Puritan. And it was more than a matter of taste. This was a matter of life and death. They fought wars over this. Even though nothing like our modern conception of race ever really entered into their minds. Contact with Africa by Europeans had occurred long ago. It was contact with the Americas that gave these European peoples and their descendants a new sense of racial identity, one that rationalized their exploitation as justified by the truth of white supremacy. Eventually, in 1619 Virginia, this led a group of them to import what were probably the first slaves from Africa into North America. The project speaks of white people and black people, but the reason those terms are even understood the way they are today is because of European contact with the original peoples of the Americas. And I think this is crucial to understanding why racialized chattel slavery took off when and where it did. More than anti-black racism, the term the project prefers, it's really white supremacy in the Americas, and battles over how much and what kind of accommodation that white supremacy is going to receive in society that defines much of the story of American political history all across the continents. Also, this change in approach will avoid the embarrassingly juvenile era of starting the story with white colonists who have free land and need free labor, and rarely, if ever, mentioning even once anyone that isn't plainly white or plainly black. Even in 1619, when there was a third group of peoples that, though dwindling, was still a huge and ongoing concern, and whose genocide had made the whole project possible. There's a similar problem in the project's leaving out of the growing population of free black people during this time, I should add. Aside from a factoid or two like name-checking Crispus Attucks, their existence is basically ignored. And I think they played a critical part in the formation of the idea of what America really was going to be or mean. Second, though I don't object, and think it's a great idea, in fact, to center a history project on the enslavement of black people with proper context given, there's really no thought in the project that I can see given to the material forces that gave rise to the phenomenon of chattel slavery's establishment and growth. Now, it would probably be asking way too much for the New York Times Magazine to begin talking about modes of production in the developing superstructure of the nascent American proto-capitalist economy, though I would love to read some stuff like that in the New York Times for sure. But it's weird that almost no thought is given even to anything like cotton's emergent status as a world commodity over time, the invention and adoption of the cotton gin, or the climate and ecology of southern North America. Slavery did not grow up equally in the country because material conditions throughout what is now the United States were not equally suited for it. No, instead it tells its readers that these particular people, these white European Americans, wanted to build a wealthy nation for themselves, and racism helped them do it. But if it really were as simple as that, why didn't the white people in Europe do it before, in their own lands? Even if we accept that the whole of white America either participated in or tolerated this chattel slavery openly. A better project might seek to answer this question. I think the reason lies in material conditions in at least two ways that I'll take a stab at. The first, broadly speaking, the natural conditions of the land in question where slavery took off, the soil, the climate, the weather that's around, all of which is essential to grow certain commodity crops, most famously cotton, but also tobacco, rice, other stuff. And as well as the conditions globally that created a demand for the nascent global market. Not all parts of the United States are equally suited to large-scale slavery as a mode of production. And so over time, without the pressure from the material reality that slavery is economically foundational to a society, slavery went away. Not because these people were good and spread freedom and those people were bad and spread slavery. The second is that these white people, such as they were in the Americas, were not all uniform. They were not all shaped by the same world. They didn't all have the same goals when they came to the Americas. I alluded briefly to the Quakers earlier, some of the earliest anti-slavery Europeans of America, but without being too simplistic, communities settled with a self-consciously religious aim can develop some powerful quirks about them. And they were not the only people to whom it would occur that all were equal in the sight of the Almighty. And because in the places they settled slavery wasn't viable as a mode of production, their ideologies were not reinforced by the need to develop justification for it. This is not about giving certain white people their proper credit. I don't care about that. But to be blunt about things, I shudder to think of what the world would be like if the white people of America really were as united in their anti-black racism, as the 1619 Project implies that they were. Material conditions in Europe created in these colonists the ideological framework they used to understand the world, which was further refined by material conditions in America. It is just more complicated than bad people enslaving innocent people, even if that is what happened. I love a good sermon, probably more than most, and obviously I've got my own set of angels and devils in American history. But people are the products of their environment. And in stories, the best heroes have flaws, and the best villains have motivations that are understandable, if not agreed upon, because that's how reality works. Here we have nothing but villains rubbing their hands together. Lastly, while I have confined myself to the distant past, for the sake of scope just now, the project goes well past the colonial and early modern America and all the way into modern times, which I want to say something about. Now, the 1619 Project seeks to center two things: the enslavement of black people by white people and the effect of that enslavement on America, as well as the contributions of those black people to America. I've said a lot about my problems with its efforts regarding the first of those, the enslavement, but not nearly so much on the contributions of those black people to America. And that's because by contributions, it doesn't seem like they mean positive contributions, but negative ones. Negative in the sense they're either contributions in opposition to their own subjugation, or contributions extracted from them in the form of profit and wealth by whites, like value of their exploitation. First under slavery, then Jim Crow, and on till today. As I said before, central to their story is not really black people, but the subjugation of black people. And those black people have done much more than just been exploited and fought that exploitation. They've done much in music, art, politics, science, lots else. And they have contributed not just to America, but to the world. Lucy Parsons, Paul Robeson, Edward Kennedy, Duke Ellington, Alain Leroy Locke, W.E.B. Du Bois, to name just a few figures I've gotten the balls to try and explain a little bit about myself on this show, were more than just black Americans fighting their own oppression by whites. Though that historic enslavement and its legacy defined many of their experiences, they were still whole, entire people who embodied America both consciously and unconsciously in their work and their lives. Lucy Parsons was the daughter of a slave who passed for white, basically, because it made her socialist message more palatable. Paul Robeson was a black man, a classically trained musician with a beautiful voice, and a Stalinist. Edward Kennedy Ellington is the greatest composer of music the United States has ever produced. He is without a doubt America's Beethoven. And I offer no apologies to any Charles Ives Parsons in the audience. Alain Leroy Locke was such a brilliant philosopher, he was the first black man to ever be named a Rhodes Scholar in 1907, and fought all his life to explore existence beyond contemplating the color of his skin. And as for Du Bois, well, in addition to being one of the finest and most consequential historians of any race to ever work in America, I myself have also bestowed upon him the rarely given title Friend of the Show, despite having never met him. Now, if it sounds a little to you like I'm indicting the New York Times for not listening to my show, I don't blame you. But the point is that nothing like this seems important to the 1619 Project. There are more black Americans whose names have not crossed my list, and an endless parade of people whose stories could use some telling, not just their subjugations but their triumphs. For if I might venture some boldness, if it is true that only chance determines one's birth, it is true that all people are one's ancestors. And on this level, their stories should belong to everyone. I will conclude with this. I noted before that history has always been ideological. There is no golden past we can look to where this was not the case, and there is no future hope of it not being so. I don't see how it could ever be that way, frankly, to say nothing of whether or not this would be good or bad. Humans are always ideological and always will be, and so will their understanding of the past. The 1619 Project has been charged with being more concerned with ideology than facts, and while it's true that it has many errors of fact, both large and small, facts themselves are the tools of ideology, whether they are true or false. The 1619 Project could be free of errors of fact, and would still be gravely flawed, I fear. And the errors are telling, I think, going as they are all in one direction, and contributing to the same central point, the overstatement that America was founded as a slaveocracy, that slavery and the resulting anti-black racism is the reason why America is peculiar in what it is today, and that this anti-black racism is in its DNA. Despite the best efforts of those who might have preferred it, history hasn't played out quite so neatly for the white slaver. America has been a symbol of freedom for at least some people, some of the time, since before the United States of America ever even formed into a cohesive political body. And across ethnic boundaries, too. I know that shit might sound corny, and maybe even a little ridiculous right now, given just how shitty things are with the economy collapse and hundreds of thousands of pandemic deaths, but it's true. And the people who strove to seriously figure out what that freedom meant and how to get it to as many people as they could, whatever their precise time and place, these are my favorite types. These music makers and dreamers of dreams, for they tended to make a big splash in the world with the sorts of people who don't have much. And with such people, my heart always lies. The 1619 Project's dreams are darker to me. For beyond erasing everyone who isn't either a free white person or enslaved black person from its story, it reduces those black people to perpetual victimhood, living as they do in a country where anti-black racism runs in its very DNA, and where not even a giant civil war could change that. In the end, the project holds forth America as an exceptional nation, no longer divinely blessed, as Americans of generations past and present thought and think of it, but as cursed. I don't know if Arthur O'Shaughnessy had anything like any of that in mind when he wrote poetry. Actually, I highly doubt he did. But I do know that words, once written, become forever the readers, and not the authors. And he wrote some words once in a poem called Ode, usually referred to by its first lines, "We are the music makers and we are the dreamers of dreams," which has obviously been banging your head around in my head a little bit. 3 stanzas in particular resonate with me in regards to all I have said, and I read them to you now in closing. Cool. And therefore today is thrilling, with a past day's late fulfilling, and the multitudes are enlisted in the faith that their fathers resisted, and scorning the dream of tomorrow are bringing to pass as they may, in the world for its joy or its sorrow, the dream that was scorned yesterday. But we with our dreaming and singing, ceaseless and sorrowless we, the glory about us clinging of the glorious futures we see, our souls with high music ringing, O men, it must ever be, that we dwell in our dreaming and singing a little apart from ye. For we are afar with the dawning, and the suns that are not yet high, and out of the infinite morning intrepid you hear us cry, how spite of your human scorning, once more God's future draws nigh, and already goes forth the warning, that ye of the past must die. Thank you for listening. Hope that you enjoyed today's show. I'm sorry it took me a little bit of time to write. There was much more that I cut that you'll never get to hear. Rewrote several sections many times. I hope it made sense. And beyond that, I hope that you liked it. If you didn't like it, you can go to Twitter at JeffSDudas. You can yell at me. I'm not too snobby to yell back at you. Patreon.com/JeffSDudas is how you support the show. There's also a PayPal link, paypal.me/distant I love it when people put money there. See you next time.